Good evening and welcome. This is a really great occasion here tonight. I want to say that actually when you come to a place like this, it's very important the kind of welcome that you receive. And just from a sort of personal perspective, I really want to thank Gerald for being such a wonderful friend and so kind and generous to me when I came here a couple of years ago. And I think it makes a big difference to have people like Gerald who are really incredible citizens of our school, but also really incredible citizens of the university. And I think those of you who know Jerold Kayden, you also know that he plays such an incredible role at the university level in terms of making people connected, making things happen, and making really good things happen. So we're very grateful and thankful to you. I also want to, before we get going, recognize Gerald's mother, Mrs. Mildred Kayden. It's not very often that we get our mothers in the audience, so Mrs. Kayden normally lives in Florida, but we're very fortunate that she is here tonight, and I think that you will like this lecture. Those of you who don't know, it's customary also for people who've been chairs of departments to give a talk in their penultimate semester. This is not Gerald's penultimate semester, but we are very happy that he is here. I am actually have to add another note of gratitude because Gerald's term as co-chair of the Department of Urban Planning and Design was to end almost as I started here, and Gerald kindly agreed to stay on for another year and postpone his sabbaticals. So he also does things like that as part of being a great citizen. So it's very, very important. And furthermore, he has sort of interrupted really a trip to Bhutan to be here with us. I guess that's also very, very important that you could leave Bhutan and be here for this talk. Gerald is really one of the specialists in the field of private and public partnership. Specifically, of his work, or part of his work, has focused on privately owned public space. And one of his books is, in fact, on that topic. The book is entitled Privately Owned Public Space, the New York City Experience. And I think one of the things that is very important about this book, because it really deals with a number of significant issues that we are hoping to address more and more in the school, is the very fact of the idea that the formation of our cities is so much dependent now on issues of real estate, issues of private ownership. And I think when you have to address those issues, they raise all sorts of other topics. And of course, because of the fact that Gerald is not only a planner, but also a lawyer, this combination of dealing with issues of property and law then addresses, for example, as he deals with in his book, such issues as when should the private sector be given prime responsibility, can law secure good design, what responsibilities does this place on the shoulders of government, what are the kind of repercussions of the tensions between private and public ownership. And I think these are very important, very relevant issues in terms of how we begin really to think about the future of public space, which is ends up being also private. If you've looked at this, Gerald's book or read Gerald's book, you also know that a major part of the book is also devoted to a kind of documentation of these privately owned public sites. It's a kind of scholarly Zegat guide of privately owned public spaces. And I think the important thing also about that kind of document is that it also becomes a mechanism, in a sense, for the rediscovery of the spaces that the citizens have the rights of participation in them. So in a sense, without that documentation or without that book, those kinds of spaces would also be much more hidden and therefore not so directly within the rights of the citizens. It's actually very close to something that I know from my experience in the UK, which is the Ramblers Society, where there are these societies who are basically a kind of charity that takes it upon itself to keep up the notion of access to public, in many of those instances are privately owned domains that are actually have public right of access. And so it's the responsibility of Ramblers in some sense to also provide that kind of access and rights of way to the countryside. And I think your book, in many respects, actually gives us that right to the city. In addition to this book, Gerald has also written other books, Landmark Justice, The Influence of William J. Brennan on America's Communities, and Zoning and The American Dream, Promises Still to Keep, as well as, of course, many articles and other texts. If I also really, to be honest, didn't know that Gerald had done so many wonderful things and so many amazing things, so I think I should share some of those things with you, that in addition to being the Frank Backus Williams Professor of Urban Planning at the GSD, as a planner and lawyer, Jerold Kayden has served governments, non-governmental organizations, private developers around the world. He has represented clients in court, appeared as expert witness, and written amicus curiae briefs in significant U.S. Supreme Court land use cases. And for the past 15 years, he's been the principal constitutional counsel to the National Trust for Historic Preservation in D.C. He founded and heads Advocates for Privately Owned Public Spaces, a nonprofit organization in New York City, whose mission is to, of course, promote the city's zoning created plazas, arcades, and indoor spaces. He has been a consultant to the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, the United States Agency for International Development, and the United Nations Development Program, working in China, Nepal, Armenia, Ukraine, and Russia. I just wonder when he had time to teach, when he's so busy doing all these things. But from 1992 to 1994, he was senior advisor on land reform and privatization to the government of Ukraine on behalf of USAID and PATCO. Professor Kayden's numerous honors include Guggenheim Fellowships, awards from the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning, the Environmental Design Research Association, the American Bar Association, the American Society of Landscape Architects, and several National Endowment for the Arts Fellowships. And he, of course, was recognized as the Teacher of the Year at the GSD, which is probably the best honor that you received. Gerald received his undergraduate degree, his law and city planning degrees from Harvard. So he has been with the university really for a long time and has been, committed to the university for a long time. And I think very importantly, after graduating, Gerald served as the law clerk to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit Judge James L. Oakes, and of course the U.S. Supreme Court Justice William J. Brennan, Jr., which I think must have been wonderfully important. I think it's very important to say that we all love Gerald, and Gerald also wants all of us to love him, which is very important. And would you please welcome my friend, our friend, Jerold S. Kayden.
Thank you, Moisen, for that very delightful introduction. First, let me address my mother, or maybe address all of you by saying I love my mother very much, but I did not ask her to come up specially for this public lecture, and she didn't. I won't invade her privacy as to why she's here, but she did stay on an extra day to hear this, so thank you very much, Mom. I would also like to, before I start my talk, thank several people that make being a chair or co-chair of a department possible. Rudolfo, where are you? There you are. Thank you, Rudolfo, co-chair to me and a wonderful colleague. Former Dean Alan Altshuler, the faculty of the department. I could list all of you. I won't, but it really doesn't work without you. The staff, Pat Roberts, Ellen, everybody, Alan Altshuler, everybody. It just makes it possible to function in a job that's very interesting but time-consuming as well. And I'm delighted to be on sabbatical. I do miss students. They make it all worthwhile as well. It makes it a rich intellectual environment. So let me now begin. I recently noticed a news item on the Harvard Graduate School of Design webpage reporting on graduation ceremonies this past June. The item described the following scene, and I quote, "After addressing the graduates and guests, Dean Moisen Mustafavi gave special tribute to Gerald, Kayden, and Rodolfo Machado, outgoing co-chairs of the Department of Urban Planning and Design, and to Neil Kirkwood, who steps down as chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture," which prompted a standing ovation. You see, I think we professionals understandably, but too often, look to others to validate who we are and what we do. Or in polar opposition, we too often marinate with introspection about who we are and what we do. Indeed, this room has sampled its fair share of marinated presentations. And I could have added to that menu by, for instance, punctuating my lecture title, "The Place of Planning," with a question mark or an exclamation point. Perfect for a Piper Auditorium lecture. I did not punctuate, which is not to say that there are no questions to be posed, no debates to be had, no critical voices to be raised, indeed no introspection to be launched about what is or should be the place of planning. But it is to foreground that my brief this evening starts from the proposition that planning does not require an existential examination. It is a long-standing, established professional field adorned with all the trappings of classic professionhood: paying jobs, academic degrees, academic organizations, accreditation, professional associations, certification, continuing education, and so forth. Instead, what I propose to do tonight is to elaborate on the double meaning of my title. First, to describe the place of modern planning as profession, with a particular look at its century-old history in the United States. And second, to argue that planning's unique calling as profession should be to plan place. I will conclude my talk with some examples of my own work over the years that exemplify aspects of such an approach to planning, and thereafter we'll be happy to entertain questions. Our overall engagement should last for no more than an hour or so. We need first to rehearse briefly the definition of a profession and how planning is one. The American Heritage Dictionary has as good a definition as any. A profession is an occupation such as law, medicine, or engineering that requires considerable training and specialized study. By that, of course, planning happily qualifies. Even here, I need to qualify what I mean. Since everyone does planning, I planned this talk for this evening. If I say I am a planner, the question automatically arises of what? The planning I am discussing, of course, is first and foremost engaged with a certain kind of ordering of geographically defined areas, normally cities, neighborhoods, or regions. But that is not enough, and I will drill down much further in a moment. But planning herein is definitively not about planning economies or defenses or social safety nets or health systems or education, even as engagement with the ordering of the city through planning does, of course, affect economy and defense and health. Let me quickly, if tediously, paint a baseline statistical and institutional portrait of the profession. In terms of paying jobs, The United States Bureau of Labor Statistics lists urban and regional planners within its standard occupational classification system and reported in 2006 that there were 34,000 planners in the United States. Job growth was expected to increase faster, I'm happy to tell our students, than the average for other occupations through 2015. About 2/3 of these planners were employed by local governments, with the rest employed by private companies doing consulting, architecture, engineering, and similarly related work, by state agencies dealing with housing, transportation, and environmental planning, and a few working for the federal government. Today, the American Planning Association, the professional trade organization for planners, reports that it has 43,500 members. By contrast, architects held roughly 132,000 jobs in 2006, with 7 out of 10 working in firms, mostly with fewer than 5 workers. Only a small number worked for the government. Landscape architects, by the way, held 28,000 jobs in 2006, with greater than 50% in private firms and about 6% in state and local governments. So planning is very much about working for local governments rather than for firms or private industry, at least as compared with our siblings of architecture and landscape architecture. What about planning education? The Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning lists 91 full and 16 affiliated member institutions, totaling 106 schools, offering mostly graduate and some undergraduate accredited planning degrees. Some of those schools also offer PhDs in planning, and according to a study I conducted with planning colleagues last year, there were 365 planning PhDs awarded nationwide for the 4-year period 1998 to 2002. Like architecture and landscape architecture programs, planning programs are visited periodically by mixed teams of scholars and professionals to assure that they are worthy of accreditation under criteria developed jointly by the schools of planning associations and the professionally oriented American Institute of Certified Planners. Can planners practice their craft without a state-granted license? The answer generally is yes. Only one state, New Jersey, requires that planners hold a professional planner's license for much work, something that a long ago predecessor of mine as planning department chair here at Harvard, Larry Mann, fought long and hard to bring about. By the way, that's why there's no planning in New Jersey. Other than, of course, our dear Tony. Are you certified? All right. By contrast, architects must be licensed in all 50 states, and landscape architects, at least as of several years ago, had to be licensed in 49 of the 50. Don't ask, I don't know. That is to say, I don't know the 50th. Alaska? Thank you, Charles. As a substitute for state-administered licensing, the American Planning Association has exhorted planners for years to be certified by its associated professional arm, the Certified Planners Institute, attempting to persuade by producing data showing that certified planners are paid more in salary than uncertified ones. Some 16,000 planners out of the APA's 43,500 members have been persuaded and are certified, an anointing that principally involves passing a multiple choice examination. So what do planners do? Lots of adjectival labels variously indicating territorial scale, sectoral specialization, representational interest, or theoretical approach suggest different categories of planning. There is urban planning, city planning, neighborhood planning, site planning, regional planning, land use planning, spatial planning, physical planning, master planning, environmental planning, advocacy planning, collaborative planning, and so forth, all of which are adjectives meaningful to planners. These labels, of course, only partly illuminate what planners do. So what do they do? There is the empirical answer, and then there is the normative answer. The short answer is lots of things. My long answer is too many things. That is both planning's strength and weakness, and I will shortly argue for a sharpening of the focus of planning practice. According to the American Planning Association, urban and regional planning is a systematic, creative approach and method used to address and resolve social, physical, and economic problems of neighborhoods, cities, suburbs, and metropolitan areas. Note the subdivisions inherent in this definition. Planning is systematic. Planning is creative. It is both an approach and a method. It addresses and it resolves. Planning deals with social, physical, and economic problems, as if, by the way, the physical is truly quite distinct from the social and the economic. It does so at different scales and geographies, neighborhoods, cities, suburbs, and metropolitan areas. From what I can glean from the APA definition, planning is capacious enough to include lots of professionals as APA members. After all, public health professionals use systematic approaches to address social problems in neighborhoods. So do social workers. Economists use systematic approaches to address economic problems in cities. Educators, lawyers, engineers, architects, public policy professionals, indeed many professionals, it would seem, could be a planner under this definition, and the historical trajectory of planning tends to reflect a generous willingness to flatten the field so that it could be accessible to all comers. Chester Hartman, an urban planner who decades ago served on the Harvard planning faculty, wrote years ago, "City planning is a most peculiar activity and a most peculiar profession. Indeed, there is probably no other single field of endeavor where so much controversy and confusion exist about what exactly the activity is and should be. No other profession so uncertain as to whether, in fact, it is a profession." And yet, he continues, paradoxically, city planning has grown phenomenally in the post-war decades, as measured by most of the obvious indices of size and influence. The number of cities with planning departments, their size and budget, the number of planning schools and planning graduates, the influence of the professional association and journals. For me, it is precisely the robustness of the hand-wringing, along with the practice in the field, that has laid to rest any doubts about planning as profession. So I ask for a third time, what do planners do? A review of planners' actual practice through the more than 100-year history of planning, especially in the United States, is illuminating. I am using the United States as case study for my talk this evening, not as a claim for exceptionalism. Indeed, the comparative study of planning practices and pedagogy throughout the world is crucial. I actually think, however, that my overarching points, at least as points of departure, may be impressed for a general discussion of planning as practiced elsewhere. In an attempt at oversimplified synthesis of a complicated story, I would suggest that planning practice and how it is historicized, theorized, and presented in the academy may be separated into three streams: the physical, the socioeconomic, and the facilitative. The physical stream chooses as the central object upon which planning acts the array of buildings, infrastructure, and public spaces, what we today may call the built environment, constituting the city. The argument goes, intelligently developed in terms of location, form, and uses within, getting the built environment right is a means through which society advances desirable social and economic ends for individuals as they live, work, and play. At heart, this is an argument for a benign environmental determinism, at least insofar as it posits that a properly planned built environment will provide individuals with better choices to achieve the good life, however defined. Swimmers in this stream have come to it from traditional design and non-design backgrounds. Some have relied more heavily on architecturally oriented methodologies, formal precedents, and formal outcomes. Others have employed more analytic, evidence-based methodologies. Some have emphasized two-dimensional diagrams. Others represent with three. Nonetheless, they are broadly united by the singularity of the object, to wit, the arrangement of buildings, infrastructure, and public space on land. Everyone will have their personal list of people and plans populating this physically oriented stream. One could easily make the argument that planning's origins in the United States lie in what we otherwise call landscape architecture, And that's more than a century before Charles Waldheim and others inscribed the phrase landscape urbanism into our professional vocabularies. Frederick Law Olmsted did far more than Central Park, and his 1869 plan for the Chicago suburb of Riverside is a precursor of today's modern suburb. Daniel Burnham is the name most often attached to the City Beautiful movement at the turn of the 20th century, and his Beaux-Arts influence plan for the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 and his Chicago plan of 1909, co-authored with little recognized Edward Bennett, are legendary in urban planning history. By the way, his famous quote about planning is almost always truncated, so let me deliver it for once in full. Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood. Truncated. Here he continues, and probably themselves will not be realized. Make big plans. Aim high in hope and work, remembering that a noble, logical diagram, once recorded, will never die, but long after we are gone will be a living thing, asserting itself with ever-growing insistency. A number of utopian plans have had their own deep influence. Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre City is one example abroad, Tony Garnier's Industrial City, Le Corbusier's Plan Voisin and Radiant City may be cited among many others. And yes, there is Ebenezer Howard and Patrick Abercrombie and Clarence Stein and Patrick Geddes and Walter Burley Griffin, and on we go. What is perhaps less understood but needs to be emphasized is how a broad phalanx of analytically oriented thinkers, drawn from non-design backgrounds of planning, as well as law, engineering, finance, and public health, equally contributed to the physical planning stream through the championing of the so-called comprehensive plan and its implementing and ultimately substituting tool of comprehensive zoning. As Anthony Ellefson has written, there was a shift from the City Beautiful movement to the City Scientific movement. Progressivism was in the air, in the water, on the land, in the zeitgeist of the era, and it would be extruded through an overtly physical planning framework. That would be evident from the proceedings of the first ever National Conference on City Planning in Washington, D.C. in 1909. It would be evident in the studies leading to enactment in 1916 of the United States' first ever comprehensive zoning resolution in New York City, where the famous trio of use, shape, and bulk controls was mapped throughout the city. It would be clear from the impressive collection of data, tables, charts, norms, rules of thumb, and diagrams presented in a little-known but enormously interesting series of books published by Harvard University Press in the 1930s, entitled Harvard City Planning Studies, with its initial red volumes entitled, among other things, Airports, Charles, Building Height, Bulk, and Form, Neighborhoods of Small Homes, Urban Land Uses, Transition Zoning, the Design of Residential Areas, Model Laws for Planning Cities, Counties, and States, with, incidentally, Frank Backus Williams as one of the authors, the namesake for my chair, and so forth. Volume 4, Urban Land Uses, is subtitled Amounts of Land Used and Needed for Various Purposes by Typical American Cities. Indeed, it is worth noting that Harvard University itself played a seminal role in initiating the broad approach to physical planning education when Professor James Sturgis Pray, in 1909, 100 years ago, taught the first city planning course ever offered in the Department of Landscape Architecture. He writes in 1914, to plan or replan a city, or any considerable portion of one, intelligently, involves an adequate knowledge not only of the principles, the limitations, and the possibilities of good planning as applied in general to cities, but also of a greater or less number of significant local facts. For Professor Pray, these local facts were deeply statistical, involving the natural environment, the human and, as he called it, humanized environment, including housing, work, education, transportation, and other conditions, existing legislation, and economic and financial conditions. And the breadth and orientation of the planning endeavor would be made crystal clear in two enormously influential documents crafted by the national government under the stewardship of then Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, the 1924 Standard State Zoning Enabling Act and the 1928 Standard City Planning Enabling Act. These were not laws, but rather models of potential laws issued by the national government and for sale for 15 cents, by the way, to encourage state legislatures around the country to enact state laws that would institutionalize physical planning, planners, and plans within local governments. Listen to excerpts from the Standard City Planning Enabling Act. Any municipality is authorized to make, adopt, extend, add to, or carry out a municipal plan and create by ordinance a planning commission. The function of the planning commission is to make and adopt a master plan for the physical development of the municipality. The commission shall conduct careful and comprehensive surveys and studies of present conditions and future growth of the municipality, and with due regard to its relation to neighboring territory. The purpose of the plan is guiding and accomplishing a coordinated, adjusted, and harmonious development of the municipality and its environs, which will, in accordance with present and future needs, best promote health, safety, morals, order, convenience, prosperity, and general welfare, as well as efficiency and economy in the process of development. And finally, the plan, with the accompanying maps, plats, charts, and descriptive matter, shall show the Commission's recommendations for the development of said territory, including, among other things, the general location, character, and extent of streets, viaducts, subways, bridges, waterways, waterfronts, boulevards, parkways, on and on and on, the general location of public buildings and other public property, as well as a zoning plan for the control of the height, area, bulk, location, and use of buildings and premises. And zoning would have to be in accordance with this comprehensive plan, all physical. In the succeeding decades, with a vengeance, state after state, local government after local government created planning commissions, prepared comprehensive plans, and adopted comprehensive zoning ordinances. Commencing in 1954, the national government, through its Section 701 program, provided 2/3 matching grants to local governments for the preparation of comprehensive plans in small towns and large cities. That program spawned a cottage industry of private planning consulting firms devoted to the preparation of comprehensive plans, especially for small towns. In 1964, the Urban General Plan, a book written by Berkeley City Planning professor T.J. Kent Jr., critiqued aspects of the past 30 years of practice while ultimately blessing the general model of the comprehensive and physical plan. Now, the comprehensive plan and implementing zoning were hardly the sole physically oriented techniques used by planners. I could speak as well about infrastructure as armature, represented robustly in the regional plan of New York and its environs, and championed by Lewis Mumford, or the well-scorned and recently rehabilitated by Hilary Ballin and Ken Jackson, plans of Robert Moses for the New York City region, David Crane's capital web theory, the passel of urban renewal plans for blighted parts of the city, and so forth. New towns had their own brief moment of glory in the United States under Titles 4 and 7. Smart growth and new urbanism planning may be argued as the most recent manifestations of the physical planning stream. Even the ascendancy of historic preservation and adaptive reuse itself may be viewed as a physical solution to city development. If the physically oriented stream of planning had more or less dominated the profession as described, it certainly did not survive without deep criticism, much of which arose from within the Planning Academy itself. An early locus for attack was comprehensive planning itself, especially the comprehensive plan, as much because its end-state presumption never truly became the lodestar of urban development. Plans often ended up gathering the proverbial dust on the shelf. Charles Lindblom, in his 1959 well-known article, The Science of Muddling Through, substituted the idea of incrementalism for comprehensiveness. Our own Alan Altshuler, in his trenchant 1965 reality check, The City Planning Process, A Political Analysis, examined 4 case studies in the Twin Cities area of Minneapolis and St. Paul, including a comprehensive plan in Minneapolis, to demonstrate the disconnect between the theoretical, aspirational qualities of rational comprehensive planning and the day-to-day political realities of American city development. The physical planning failures of urban renewal and public housing, cogently observed by sociologists like Herbert Gans, added to the growing enchantment with physical solutions. In its place arose a second, non-physical stream of planning that viewed the territory of the city less as a collection of physical structures and more as the locus of social and economic interactions, whose enhancement would not depend on privileging physical over non-physical solutions. The non-physical socioeconomic stream gained particular strength in academic planning departments, beginning especially in the 1970s, with the ascendancy of quantitative methods, public policy approaches, modeling, and economics to planning, crushing any interest in or teaching about the physical, a trend I described in an article from several years ago entitled, "What is the Mission of Harvard's Urban Planning Program?" Among others, Berkeley professor Alan Jacobs, Donald Appleyard, and our own Alex Krieger have written critically of this shift away from the physical. In part, the debate played out through a people versus place framework with the emphasis on helping people through direct transfers, for example, Section 8 vouchers and certificates for affordable housing, rather than ameliorating place through bricks and mortar investments. A third stream of planning rejects top-down, expert-driven end-state physical planning and top-down, expert-driven socioeconomic planning and installs instead eliciting, mediating, and/or empowering the views of some or all stakeholders or interest groups as planning's object. Process becomes king. The roots of this approach may be traced to the mid-1960s advocacy planning of Paul Davidoff, the early 1970s guerrilla planning of Robert Goodman, and more recently, the equity planning of Norman Krumholtz and John Forrester. Much of their attack arises from the belief that planners have become co-opted by the powerful or at best are too detached and technocratic, and that their role instead should be to empower the powerless. There is also here a rejection, broadly grounded in postmodern and post-structural theory, of the master narrative of positivist and normative approaches to problem solving through technical expertise and scientific, rational, analytic, or design approaches. The technical jargon of expertise often obscures assumptions and value judgments built into the system, observes Berkeley's Marty Wax in an influential article. Most recently, a group of scholars has developed a theory and practice of communicative planning. Grounded in the fertile soil of Jürgen Habermas, Berkeley's Judith Innes and the UK's Patsy Healy, among others, have emphasized how talk is the stuff of planning action. They have studied how information is used and embedded in planning, given that much of planning is actually talking and influencing. Other theorists have contributed their own notions about how planners communicate. The University of British Columbia's Leonie Sandercock's interest in storytelling and narratives is one example. Larry Susskind of MIT has spearheaded the insertion of negotiation and its win-win paradigms into the planning model. Innes and Susskind both, among others, have now turned their attention particularly to planning as fostering collaboration and consensus building. Facilitated meetings are increasingly in vogue, and facilitative planners are sought throughout the field. If I have accurately cataloged the well springs of planning as profession through these three streams, the normative question going forward remains, what should be the place of planning? As with any professional field, this is a question to be answered first and foremost by members of the planning profession and its academy. As a prerequisite, I will assert the non-controversial proposition that planning must have a discrete mission that distinguishes itself from other professional fields and academic disciplines that also address the condition of the city. The practice of planners must lead people to say, now that's a job for planners, rather than, now that's a job for architects or for economists or lawyers or engineers. This is not to deny, in mapping a Venn diagram of urban-oriented professions, that there cannot be overlapping territories among the various circles. Indeed, some of the most interesting terrain is to be found in that interdisciplinary overlap at the peripheries of otherwise siloed professions. But it is to say that if everything a planner does can be done equally well by a fully distinct profession, then planning will have lost any claim to the first call. So what do I envision as the place of planning? Without sounding overly tautological, I see planners, planning, place. By place, I mean physical things, located here, not there, in a certain form, occupied by certain uses. As planning's object, place is more evocative than the more neutral stance of built environment. Unlike built environment, place reverberates with positivist, aspirational attributes connoting memory, associative values, community, centrality, Lynchian legibility, Alexander identity, and so forth. It may be the place where everyone knows your name, an idea celebrated as much in pop culture, that's the Cheers lyric, as in marketing strategies and professional practice. Developers commonly employ the pop speak of place. Charles Bull's Placemaking, published by the developer community's own Urban Land Institute, the recently published Brown-Dixon-Gillum book, Urban Design for an Urban Century, Placemaking for People, Fleming and von Charner's Placemakers, and Claire Cooper Marcus and Carolyn Francis' People Places are but a few on a long list of professional tomes devoted to finding and making place out of the built environment. The Project for Public Spaces has its well-attended, if formulaic, placemaking training sessions, while the American Planning Association inaugurated its Great Places in America flagship program to recognize places of exemplary character, quality, and planning. Sociologist Ray Oldenburg has examined what he calls the third place beyond work and residence in his books, The Great Good Place and Celebrating the Third Place. Place has power that needs to be researched and celebrated, argued Dolores Hayden in her 1995 book, The Power of Place, Urban Landscapes as Public History. And place also has a radical power, as argued recently by geographer Harm de Blay in his new book, The Power of Place, Geography, Destiny, and Globalization's Rough Landscape. Notwithstanding the forces of globalization, mobility, and interconnectedness we hear so much about, de Blay insists that geography continues to hold billions of people in an unrelenting grip. And conveniently, unlike city, place as terminology can apply to any scale from site to neighborhood to central business district to city to region. By making place, or if you won't, built environment as object, then I am not surprisingly squarely in the camp of those who see planning first and foremost as swimming in the physical stream. That is where our uniqueness lies, I believe, in addressing the condition of the city. There is also the challenge in defining what planners should do in planning place, and especially distinguishing planning approaches from urban design, architecture, and landscape architecture approaches, as all grapple with the physicality of cities, regions, and place. Let's ask the tough question directly and openly. Are urban designers different than urban planners? Of course, like place, urban design has become a catch-all, feel-good phrase that can apply equally to the product of physically oriented planning as that of ensemble architecture. Ich bin ein urban designer, said President John F. Kennedy, I believe, as he stood in a public space near the Berlin Wall. But while that looseness in usage is fine for design firm marketing strategies and popular consumption, it runs the danger within the academy and the profession of obscuring the real difference that separate the architect as urban designer and the high skill involved in that proposition and the planner as physical planner. As I argued more than 5 years ago in this very auditorium, and as I argue again tonight, planners educated solely as planners cannot invest in their physical city assets derived from the core knowledge, formal training, visual and representational technical skills, and cultural affinities earned through years of sweat and tears and practice by architects, landscape architects, and post-professional design degree urban designers in school and thereafter. As a first professional degree, and 2 years at that, and given the immutability of the 24-hour day, even if it sometimes seems like 24 hours in Gund Hall, planning educators, students, and professionals must make pedagogical and professional choices and recognize their strengths and limitations. And, by the way, if a planning student chooses to endure another several years of tuition to earn concurrently or in the future an architecture or landscape architecture degree, then more power to her, and vice versa. I, after all, am a product of 2 degrees, law and city planning. Planners as planners may occupy a unique terrain best encapsulated by the 5 W's plus an H that have been variously attributed to Hermogoras of Temnos, a rhetorician from the 1st century BC, and Rudyard Kipling in his Just So stories, but are most usually presented in Journalism 101 classes. Planners address the who, what, when, where, why, and how of place, although not in that order. By what? I mean composing through research, analysis, and imagination the program of uses, not just formally or morphologically accommodating it. By where, I mean determining the better and worse locations for uses and form. By who, I mean who acts upon a plan and who is benefited and harmed by it. By how, I mean implementation and its three-legged stool of law, finance, and politics that brings life to planning. I like to say, to plan is human, to implement divine. And the public-private partnership is just one of many models to be critiqued as well as celebrated in this implementation scheme. By when, I mean phasing of actions. And finally, by why, I mean the insistent voice that asks fundamental questions and ensures that planners maintain at all times a critical distance from their own actions, such that they do not fall into routines that so often afflict professions, and that to a large degree became, in planning's case, the bane with its love affair of urban renewal, or the latest flavor of the month. The product of the planner's work is not limited to a two-dimensional plan, even if the eventual object depends on spatial understandings and physical arrays. Planners can engage with various moments in the planning act, from ideas to research to plans to implementation, and do not need to do it all, let alone all at once, in order to render themselves planners. In fact, for me, although they must learn how to prepare plans and be skilled at it, planners can be planners without ever preparing a specific plan, as long as they are truly engaged with how place is generated through buildings, infrastructure, and public space. The new urbanists realized this when they reintroduced codes and norms as well as plans, whether it be the 5-minute walking radius or form-based codes, both powerful organizing principles for physical planning. In pursuing the who, what, when, where, why, and how of place, planners can be creative as well as analytic, remembering that creativity is not synonymous with visualizing or representing with pencil or computer, and that imagination is not the sole province of the artist. Research becomes a crucial methodological element in the planner's toolkit, and the ways of social sciences and the humanities both can provide knowledge that enlightens the planner's activities. Indeed, the broader, less professionally oriented education of urban studies or academic urbanism become a wonderful backdrop within which professional education can occur, as long as they supplement rather than replace the professional and respect the finite resource of time. Through research, planners can understand, analyze, and ultimately influence the variety of forces, social, economic, political, legal, environmental, technological, cultural, and human agency shaping place. This is as powerful, albeit different, an engagement with the physical as any design may be. And finally, underlying all of planning is its abiding commitment to the public interest. As Susan Feinstein and Scott Campbell have written, the central task of planners is serving the public interest in cities, suburbs, and the countryside. This out-front assumption distinguishes planning from other occupations. Most planning jobs are creatures of public law and government and are thus axiomatically imbued with conventionally construed public interest commitments and aspirations. The profession's mission, as defined in the association's Code of Ethics, is to seek social justice by working to expand choice and opportunity for all persons, recognizing a special responsibility to plan for the needs of the disadvantaged and to promote racial and economic integration. If the definition of the just city is about to enjoy its fullest expression, and Professor Feinstein's about to be published book on the just city, we will just have to wait and see how she elaborates on this core planning principle. And of course, more recently, sustainability has joined the public interest overlay. Indeed, sustainability proponents have merged justice and fairness into their environmental equation. So what I'd like to do now for 10 minutes is present some of my own work that fits into this framework that I have suggested of what planning should be normatively, to suggest how I have had my moments of interaction with ideas, research, plans, and implementation that qualify me to claim I am a planner, at least defined by me. So why don't we begin? So it's a little-known fact that I was indeed the third collaborator with Mies and Philip on this building. No, actually, this represents the sort of precursor to this phenomenon of privately owned public space, plazas, arcades, and in other outdoor and indoor spaces in New York City with the base. This was not produced by law. This was produced by creativity. The backdrop here of slide is actually one of the public spaces that was produced under this New York City program that our dean referenced, starting in 1961, through law, the production of privately owned public space. By now, more than 530 privately owned public spaces in New York, falling into 12 categories, like plazas, arcades, and other outdoor and indoor spaces. I did research on this as a scholar, purely within the academy. I got my data from the Department of City Planning and help from the Municipal Art Society of New York, but I wrote the book. It was my scholarship, leading to an application in a consulting vein, some not-for-profit, in planning. These are some of these rotten spaces. The two conclusions of the book were that an enormous number of spaces, 41% in fact, were of marginal quality out of the 530. That's not a good batting average. And they look like this and this, all legal, not in violation of law, or they violated the law. And roughly 50% of all buildings with public space in New York City, those are the 500-plus spaces, had a space or spaces apparently out of compliance with applicable legal standards, including denial of access or other sorts of privatization strategies. So I'd like to talk about what I did post that research in two aspects of being a planner. One was situated primarily, I guess, in the category of ideas. And the idea was that many of these spaces in New York had been under-realized, but with the expenditure of money could become wonderful new physical attributes in the city. And the best way to make this happen would be to encourage nearby for-profit or not-for-profit institutions to adopt underperforming privately owned public spaces. That was an idea I had. And in collaboration with Lincoln Center, and in particular the president of Lincoln Center, Ren Levy, we alighted on one particular space known as Harmony Atrium. Here it is. Here's Columbus Circle. Here's the Lincoln Center campus. Here's the space between Broadway and Columbus Avenue in New York. A rotten space. Lincoln Center decided that it would be in its interest to take over the space for discount ticketing activities and other informational activities. And I, representing the public on planning, thought that their $20 million investment could improve the space. And indeed, that's exactly what has happened. We ran together a large design competition in which the following architects were invited to submit, and they all did. 7 were actually chosen for finalists, and then cut down to 2 finalists, and the winner was Todd Williams, Billy Chin, Todd Williams, and they have done this space. I'll just show you a few images of it. It's opening in, I think, a week and a half. The other finalist was Tom Main and Morphosis. They all came and presented a number of times. Here were his images. Placing an object within the space itself to produce this. Here's a second planning intervention by me, represented by an event called the Red Chair event. Sort of looks oddly familiar. This was from several years ago. And again, this is an idea and a plan and implementation, if I can call it that, coming out of research. The idea was to activate these spaces simply by placing chairs in them. In fact, red chairs, something that Harvard University has now pursued. And with Ken Smith, he and I came up with an entire proposal for the Red Chair event by taking these chairs, locating in the plan a specific area for insertion of these chairs, locating the specific plazas on which they would sit, coming up with themes for them, and then having a parade that would actually take hundreds of chairs on one day, marching down the street and being planted on these particular privately owned public spaces with the permission, by the way, of the owners, although I had been enthusiastic about guerrilla planning in the Robert Goodman sense. So here's one of them. It's the greens, and that was the idea for that. Simple ideas. Here was the siesta, and the palms, the garden, classic Ken Smith intervention right there. And finally, the beach at a strip plaza that is otherwise fairly meaningless. I've also done planning work internationally, and I just want to briefly reference a couple. This is Kathmandu, where I just was a couple of weeks ago. Years ago, I did work in preparing a plan for the Kathmandu Valley Development Authority, which had been created by the then king. His name is right there. He no longer is alive. He was assassinated with other members of his family. In any event, in order to address the pollution and other health problems resulting from brickyards scattered through the Kathmandu Valley, as well as pollution being dumped into the river, as well as lots of other polluting activities, I came up with others with a plan for the Kathmandu Valley that was very, very simple. You can build here and you can't build there. And this, as a substitute for the country's reliance on principles deriving from the British Town and Country Planning Act of 1947, which is about the most complicated administrative planning mechanism invented by personkind. And I should just say, coming from Bhutan, I'm sorry to report that Thimphu, its capital city of 100,000 people, is relying on British town planning principles, all again coming out of a colonial tradition that has impacted these areas. In Ukraine, where I worked for 2 years, I developed with Ukrainian officials at local and national levels land auctions. And indeed, a lot of that involves selecting land parcels to be privatized. Again, very, very much a planning activity in terms of locating where private property would make sense and where public property would make more sense. Inclusionary housing programs in Santa Fe, Cambridge, Boston, many other places in the United States, dealing with trying to promote the inclusion of affordable housing in these sorts of developments designed by Jack Nicklaus and a golf course. These are the sorts of final planning activities in which you are having an enormous spatial impact by actually encouraging inclusion on site rather than so-called cash-out options, which would represent more of the people rather than places approach that I referenced. So let me conclude. There will always be creative tensions for planners, both within and without the profession. Here's, for example, the latest mini brouhaha arising between planning and design. You may have read that the New York City Planning Commission, under the leadership of planner Amanda Burden, just denied a special permit to the Hines Development Company for a Jean Nouvel design tower next to the Museum of Modern Art. In part, the decision rested on discomfort with the top of his building, whose overall height would have equaled the Empire State Building, minus its antenna. Off with its top, an irked Nikolai Arusov wrote in the New York Times, the architecture critic. And I should mention that a graduate of our planning program, Edith Suchen, director of the Manhattan Office of City Planning, participated in this decision. And also mention that she and Amanda are as design-attuned planners as there may be in the profession. This leaves me always eager for more engagement, argument, honing of skills, education, debate. Excited, nervous, ready to do planning, and excited about engaging in future discussions about what planning can be. But I would suggest at the end of the day that the professional debates can only provide so much for planning or architecture or landscape architecture or urban design. Values matter in planning, as they do in all professions, but as Suzette Kilo in 2005 reminded us in our profession in that famous Supreme Court case in which her house had been taken under the power of eminent domain. That is why I close one of my classes each year with the following reminder. And since I am on sabbatical this year, here is my best chance to deliver part of it. Perhaps we can agree upon the following normative urban project. First, we want to create a just, fair, and open city, providing opportunities for people of all incomes or backgrounds to participate meaningfully in life's many facets. Second, we want to create a productive city, a well-conceived, well-planned, well-managed, and well-maintained physical vessel in which individuals may produce the wealth required to endow justice, fairness, and openness. Third, we want to create a sustainable city that remains as intact and useful for future generations as it is for ours. And fourth, we want to create a beautiful city, one that beguiles the senses and inspires our daily lives. Together, then, we want to create a physical place capable of providing each and every member of society with the dignity and material enjoyment that are inextricably aspects of the birthright of human beings everywhere. The journey to create this city, this physical place, is a highly personal one. Education endeavors to teach a method of thinking, creativity, and a set of skills that initially equip us for the journey. But at the end of the day, no analytic approach, no creative act, and no implementing technique can substitute for personal values. No one can teach or determine those values for you and me, but I can encourage all of us to determine consciously our own values that will guide us in fashioning our lives as well as professional careers. Thank you very much for your patience this evening.
So I'm sure Gerald will take a few questions. Rick, here, please, Professor Peiser.
Gerald, what do you see as the current trends and the future of positive planning as opposed to what we've seen, I think, over the last 20 to 30 years as planners became more reactors and spending more and more of their energy, especially the public level, in regulation. So do you think we will see a return to the days when planners weren't just reacting to others' plans, but actually helping to formulate them?
Now, not only do I think we will see the return, we have seen it. Like it or not, new urbanism, which, by the way, was really not created by people who were trained as planners as such, is very, very much a, positive, quotes, plan for the way our greenfield suburbs and later our inner cities and even our Hope 6 projects should be developed. We may agree or disagree, but we can't disagree with the enormous persuasiveness that this movement has had both on private developers and on public sector officials who have bent over to change laws to permit those sorts of developments to occur. So that's one. I think regional plans through smart growth continue to have currency, and those are guiding growth into certain areas and not into others. Paul Romer has come up with the most interesting proposal recently out of Stanford for charter cities, trying to break out of the hold that, the city as jurisdiction has that prevents the sort of regional approach that we are inevitably going to need in planning for, a 50% or more majority urbanized world with cities of 17 million people, et cetera. So I think there are examples. You're correct to identify that one aspect of planning has been reactive, but I hasten to add it's been reactive physically. The decisions that are made, including the one I referenced at the end, is a physical decision that affects the physical city, albeit not necessarily in a comprehensive way. I'll also add that the city of New York has been comprehensively rezoned piece by piece over the past 8 years, just as an example.
Given that city planners at the local level are often in an advisory role only and don't have direct authority and decision-making authority and are typically subordinated to the political process and political decision makers, what do you see as the way in which planning in the United States can be made more compelling and ultimately more important and effective? What needs to change, and how can we advance that?
Right. Well, this is just the latest version of what I refer to as Alan Altshuler's trenchant criticism. I don't think, by the way, planners are as powerless as you may think. And again, I'll just reference, Arusov's, enormous irritation with a decision that literally affects very, very much development and design on the skyline of New York City. But I do think that, like any minor profession, as Nathan Glazer classified planning in a Minerva article many, many years ago, you have to be smart and savvy. That's why I emphasize, the primacy of ideas and creativity, something that planners oddly shy away from, thinking that ideas means creativity means something that they don't do. It also means developing oral communicative skills, the types of stuff that people like Judith Innes and Larry Susskind in a variety of ways manage. It also means, by the way, and I really don't want to be misunderstood, proficiency with design skills. Let it be clear, I am not arguing at all, and indeed I stand before you having championed for 5 years, a core urban planning studio sequence for our first-year planning students, a full year in which, mastering representational skills becomes an important part of what they do, because that is one of the great powers, of course, of the visual, to allow people to kick the tires by seeing rather than by hearing or just thinking or reading. So it's a mix of many, many things. No simple answers. I don't think it's as bad or as good as we might like.
I just want to, were you going to ask a question? Please.
Hey, Gil.
Hey, Gerald. Just wondering, Gerald, why for you place isn't the place where all those three streams come together in a more robust way than you've alluded to. And before you say, yes, of course it is, urban economists are a tiny subset of economics in that profession. They need to be trained in planning concepts to be any good. And if you call them urban planners, then I don't see the distinction that you're trying to make. And yet, in my practice, having urban economists and people who thought about housing policy in our overall placemaking efforts was quite critical, and I'm just a little bit nervous that you're taking large portions of the profession and telling them they don't belong any longer, or sending the wrong message to the public that values placemaking from a multi-dimensional point of view, and giving perhaps the wrong impression there.
Not at all, Gil, and let me be clear again. All I'm saying is urban planners are distinct from urban economists. I would never suggest that urban economists and lawyers and public health specialists and education, all of the various people have enormous things to contribute to the development of the good place. And I would indeed, as a planner, be happy and willing and always interested in consulting with them. But if we are no different than they in terms of the skills that we bring to bear and the solutions we have developed, then I think we have lost our identity as a separate profession. And we may as well just give up the ghost and say we're all sort of generalists groping with this thing that we call the elephant. I touch it here, you touch it there. I'm simply trying to retain what has historically been and what I think is intelligently developed as the role of planning as a set of methodologies, a body of knowledge, a set of assumptions to define a professional field. That's it. That's the whole thing. I'll mention, by the way, not as a marketing remark, that I'm completing a book right now out of a seminar that I co-taught with an urban economist, Ed Glazer, called Rethinking Cities, and it's a book that collects chapters from all of the different academic disciplines and professional fields that think about cities. And they were all tasks, all the authors, historian, sociologist, economist, planner, lawyer, engineer, environmentalist, et cetera, to draft, literally in a siloed way, what their particular academic discipline or professional field contributes in terms of thinking about cities. And then we go into, as I called it, the overlapping circle of the Venn diagram, where interdisciplinary at the peripheries takes hold. So it's not an either or.
Any comments or questions from any of the students, maybe, before we go to any students who are studying planning? Any thoughts about Gerald's suggestions and provocations? Shall we, please, we go to you, and then we'll go to you. Can we go to the lady behind you, and then you'll come.
Hi, I'm Molly. I'm a first-year planner. I just went through the whole process of trying to pick out schools, and this school is quite different from other schools in that it seems to focus on place, like you say, mostly thanks to you, I think, and other professors who are interested in placemaking. I'm just wondering what you would say people who disagree with you would argue as the place of planning, just because I clearly think I agree with you. I chose to be here. But I'm just wondering what the other argument is, if you could kind of flesh that out a little bit.
Sure. I mean, you know, this is, as I said, an engagement of a debate. There are others. I don't happen to be persuaded by the broadening or the flattening of the field. I think it loses its identity, its definition. I don't know what else combines to make somebody an urban planner as conventionally understood as opposed to something else. There are lots of ways to address the problems of place, let alone the problems of cities. Lots of different skill sets. I'm simply trying to articulate what I think is the unique contribution of planning without claiming that it is better or overclaiming. I could equally present on why economists or lawyers or engineers or architects or urban designers or landscape architects, should be the movers and shakers on cities and place. And indeed, I hope they are. I want them to be. This is not an invitation to them to withdraw from the field. Let them continue doing what they do and they do best. And we will all engage. I'm talking about urban planning as I see it.
There were a couple of questions there, maybe.
Gerald, when we were in Ukraine, our colleagues there called themselves city builders and land arrangers. Did we learn anything positive from their failure?
Tough question, Bill. And I look back at our stuff together as well. One lesson is it's tough to have, a dirigiste approach, it seems to me, to the production of the built environment if one wants to render a verdict on, one system of full 100% state ownership over another. It seems to me that choice is an important part of the game, and choice is best delivered through a variety of ownership regimes and a variety of inputs that are not directed from one person, from the top. As you may or may not recall, and I remember this, you weren't there, but this conversation very, very well in the city of Kharkiv, which is the second largest city in Ukraine. the country was introducing the first ever open competitive land auction in the former Soviet Union. And it was a pilot or demonstration project. And we were sitting down with the chief architect, who was the planning director of the city, choosing the parcels in a planning exercise. And after we chose the parcels, then we discussed what conditions, if any, would be placed on the parcel development post-auction. So he brought out a big list and started saying, on this parcel, we're going to have a barber shop, a restaurant, you know exactly what. And I said, if we're going to do this, then let's not even do the auction. It doesn't, because that's the idea. The idea is to introduce, a variety, a fine-grained, wide range of choices that can begin to influence the development of place. That's the big lesson I would draw from our experience.
Gerald, a fascinating canter through planning and what it is and should be and could be and so on. And just to echo that, actually in the UK, I think we've all had the same dilemmas. And I must just say, you referred to one of the lecturers, Patsy Healy, there. And one of the first books at planning school we had to read was entitled Town Planners in Search of a Role, which we actually renamed Town Planners in Search of the Dole, which is slang for unemployment, because at the time that was very much apropos. But for the student who was asking before, it's very much the same kind of... I wanted to pick up on the question before about planning needing to get into the political domain to actually have more meaning and more bite and so on. And I can't resist just getting back at your dig at the UK Town and Country Planning Act, which, yes, was very bureaucratic and in many ways has become more so now. But at least there is planning, there is rigorous planning, it's required, it's enforced and so on. And I now find myself in a state where planning is not really required, it's not done, comprehensive planning doesn't have the same bite for all those reasons. So what do we do about that? Should your lecture be given to the governor and all state officials and so on to actually try and change that situation?
Let me be clear. I wasn't critiquing the Town and Country Planning Act of 1947 as amended in the UK. I was critiquing it in Nepal and Bhutan. All right, that's the every planning process and system in its own place. A highly developed civil service system, a country that really came from, to some degree, a socialist, ownership background that even allowed for the conceptualization of, as we know, post-Uthwat report, the nationalization of all development rights in the UK, which ultimately foundered. And by the way, just as our system in the United States, based on, a sort of, plan implemented through zoning, and ultimately they collapsed together and became one thing based on the German system, the UK was very, very much based on the discretion system versus rule. The UK has moved more toward rule, as you know, and the United States has moved much more toward discretion. Indeed, the Amanda Burden decision that I referenced is a discretionary decision. It wasn't fixed in zoning. So we're actually, at a certain level, meeting in the middle of that pond, with the UK giving up, some degree of its discretion. Vaunted discretion and ours, giving up some of our rule. But there's no question that for historical reasons alone, the UK has a much more firmly based, planning system in which, by the way, it goes straight up in one state, effectively, as opposed to our system of 50 states and local jurisdictions, which de facto, if not de jure, actually exercise, authority over what happens within their jurisdiction.
Yeah, you mentioned about this urban economist and urban planning. There should be some difference, but without having a clear-cut, guidelines, it will be very difficult to say whether it's a job of an urban planner or urban economist. That's why there's a lot of encroachment and confusion. How to, clearly, establish that kind of thing so that there won't be any confusion or encroachment.
Right. Well, again, a lot of this comes down to the methodologies that planners will, in fact, employ, the body of knowledge that they will study, the theories that underline their approach. And I've argued for a physically oriented set of tools that planners will use to engage with literally producing, at a minimum, built form in 2 dimensions in specific locations, and also some expression in 3 dimensions of the buildings and infrastructure and public space that I've referenced. urban economists traditionally will not be doing that, and as suggested earlier even by Gil, it's not a wide profession in any event. So it's ultimately a lot of the practical distinction comes down to the set of tools that are employed, the bodies of knowledge that are studied to underlie those tools, the theories that govern the way the profession acts, and then ultimately the profession itself in terms of its various associations and the various jobs that it gets. You know, there is not a Department of Economics, you know, in Boston. There is a planning department. It happens to be a unique kind of thing. Planning departments really exist in cities around the world, unlike, you know, architecture departments within a city. I mean, it's a professional group that has been established historically, you know, for better and worse. And that's, you know, gives it, you know, a stake, you know, a power, if you will, that should not be frittered away. And indeed, I don't think has been.
Gerald, I really like a statement you have in the preface of your New York book where you say you're a city watcher. And I'd never seen that before. I know about bird watchers and so on, but it gave me an insight into you, and that fit nicely as your focus on place. I really appreciate that. I was thinking of Sir Robert Burns' old saying of change is nature's mighty law, and you mentioned one of the really giant changes, namely the urbanization. That is the number of people concentrating in cities in the world in the upcoming decades. There's another massive change out there, I think, and that's the environment. And, you know, we're running out of clean water. At least it's becoming bloody expensive, and cities are taking a lot of clean water. Sea level rising. Cities are great pumps of greenhouse gases and the water pollution that you showed in the Nepal and so forth. So I was struck that you, in drawing your boundaries of planning, you except for sort of calling the word sustainability, you excluded the environment. And so if you're going to do that, who do you recommend should step forward and take care of the environment relative to cities?
Right.
And sprawl.
Right. You know, I think that's a fair comment, Richard, and you're right to note that I sort of did my State of the Union. I better mention sustainability, you know, so that people could be. I'm not, and you know, I'd have to develop this much more. I'm not excluding, you know, the environment from, you know, the domain of the planner. And in fact, what you see is a coalescing of regimes. You know, one of them has been the land use planning regime with its associated implementing laws. And there are a set of professionals who have been dealing with that, you know, primarily at the local level. There have been another set of professionals, by the way, you know, a lot of them scientists, public policy people, you know, applied economists, who have been administering the environmental regime, you know, at the national level and at state levels, because environmental laws in this country and around the world, by the way, originated at the national level. We know pollution respects no boundaries, whether it's air or water. So that was always deemed a national problem, and in fact, if you look at the key laws in the United States dealing with environment, it's the Clean Air Act, the federal, you know, water pollution control amendments, otherwise known as the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act. All of these environmental acts are national. So you had national environment, local planning. National land use planning failed deeply in the United States. Senator Muskie's bill went down to defeat. These two things, however, are now coming together, you know, at the local level. You will find that planning is taking under its wing the whole issue of sustainability. Climate change is, you know, not only sort of technically being, you know, taken in by planning, but politically. You can talk to Gil and you can talk to all the planning directors across the country. They have spent a lot of their time over the past 3 or 4 years crafting how they are going to deal with global warming and the mitigation and adaptation which is involved in addressing that very, very issue. So although you're right, I didn't emphasize it in my talk, I wasn't suggesting that environment would not very much be part of the physical place in which planners are addressing. I was putting that under physical.
Alex, and then Hashem, and then maybe we'll get
Gerald, you're rarely at a loss for words, except momentarily in response. I think so. Maybe my voice doesn't project.
That's it. That's awesome.
So, Gerald, you're rarely at a loss for words, except momentarily in response to our planner's question. And I think a few more words deserve to be responded. She asked, what about those who don't believe that place is central to the Planning Act? I think that's a very interesting question, and of course we ask it very often here. And you know that those who worry say, well, if you permeate place, if you permeate the built, if you permeate form, heaven forbid architecture and so forth, well then the social or the political or the environmental kind of takes second place. Now, you and I don't believe that, but it certainly is. So reassure us that, in a way, or reassure the student that in permeating place, those other factors still are as essential, because without them, placemaking is simply not going to turn out very well.
Right. Well, again, I really do believe, not to suggest that I'm at a loss for words, I actually think I spent a lot of words trying to make the case that, planners' unique contribution, as opposed to others, is in using the built environment, which I called place. But by the way, I don't even have to use place, but that wasn't your point in any event. Using the built environment as a means of producing a better, set of choices for individuals as they live, work, and play. There are lots of other ways to produce a better world for people as they live, work, and play. And lots of other professionals are dealing with trying to do just that. Doctors and public health officials and education. I'm simply trying to distinguish as best I can what planners can contribute to this venture. And that's why, even though the student very nicely said, I'm convinced I came here, this is not Harvard alone. It is true that I am debating with other planning programs, which I think are, softer in their focus, broader in their focus, more capacious and welcoming, the flattening of the planning profession that indeed allows them to attract arguably more students. But I think our message, and I know you do too, Alex, is ultimately a more persuasive one for me. And I tried to spend, all of the words I spent on this lecture in addressing that. And I'd be happy to talk to you later if I didn't do a decent job.
I know Hashem wants to say something, but just following up very quickly on this issue, because it's now been mentioned. I actually wonder about the word place, to be honest, because it's like the second time that we've heard that word in this room in the last few days, because Sean Donovan mentioned it, and then you mentioned it. And of course, there's that whole history of the relationship between space and place. But I think there's also what you mentioned in terms of the kind of the oral tradition and the importance of kind of persuasion. And in one sense, I think that if you followed the argument of the oral tradition in terms of place, that I can't really find anywhere any kind of holes in your arguments that somebody like Andreas Duany would disagree with, because it would, what you say is so reasonable in some way that he would claim that new urbanism basically does everything that you're saying. And look at it, because it comes from that whole tradition of townscape. It looks kind of nice. It's very friendly. People get on. That's what place is about. And in a way, I think that that's a problem. I think that actually that really is a problem, because once you define place in such a kind of, consensual terms, and you don't define it precisely in a way that begins to argue for very specific design or qualitative attributes, then I think it's hard not to kind of see it as a generic thing that planners use to sort of say they do things that are really very, very nice and they're very friendly, right, and things like that. So I'm just actually wondering whether there is not a kind of, other people don't have a certain unease, not with the argument, but actually with the terminology, because the terminology, in a way, and I think this in some ways relates to what Richard is saying. I don't know whether today planners should not be thinking more about these larger environmental issues, that the discussion around place is actually something that is much harder to nail down, because it becomes also so subjective. Who makes those decisions in terms of, what is the right place for whom in some way, in whose name is this place kind of speaking? And I think that those sorts of issues probably need to be specified, as I think you very much did in many of the things that you presented.
Yeah, they do.
My question is a follow-up also.
All right. Well, I was going to respond, but...
It's working?
Yeah.
First of all, Gerald, I thought the lecture was extremely educational. It just confirms your great reputation as an excellent educator among the students. Thank you very much. Coming back to the question of place, and given that you've given us this fantastic survey of planning theory, and want to ask you regarding your own understanding of planning as a practice of engaged in placemaking. In most contemporary theoretical discussions about placemaking, particularly among the geographers that have in a way taken the lead in giving the underpinnings for planning theory, the notion of place is on two extremes, and within a spectrum, of course. On one extreme, it is understood to be a reaction against the forces of globalization.
Correct.
And then on the other extreme, it is understood to be the moment that we're in right now in a kind of post-global age where we are constructing place, that we are acknowledging that place is no longer what Mohsen was describing as being sort of that kind of community-oriented replication of our understanding of the traditional place, but something that we construct anew. And I'm assuming that you're thinking about it, given the cases that you've given us and given the international spectrum that your experience is coming out of, in relation to that second notion of place, or closer to that at least. But I would like to ask you to elaborate on then the underpinnings, the theoretical underpinnings and the practical underpinnings of place making, because it ultimately remains, like geography, a very fluid word, and that it might acquire past connotations, as Mohsen is highlighting, but it might be open enough for new articulations of what kinds of place can we make. Can we start pluralizing it so that there are different kinds of places that are being constructed through planning?
Yes. These are both very, very good questions. And let me admit, honestly, that even as I endorse use of the word place rather than built environment, I'm using it for the moment as a placeholder, quite frankly. And by that I mean built environment, although it too has its history, is basically neutral terminology. And I wanted to say we're doing more than built environment. We are trying to do something. So, the best word that I came up with, even as concerned as I am with the sort of commercialization, the pop speak of the word, is place. Now, it may be true that, starting with the new urbanists, and then I'll get Hashem to what you added to this, that the new urbanists claim to make place. But the key issue, the key word is claim. If they do it, I'm all for it. As I defined with the values that I imbued in my kind of place, which is just, sustainable, beautiful, productive, et cetera. I put my cards on the table, and I think those are sort of, one could argue those are indisputable because they're so general, but I think we can develop, as we do, the mechanisms to measure whether we produce that or not. My objection to new urbanism, to the extent I object, is not to the goals, not even necessarily to the techniques employed. It's to whether or not it actually produces what it claims to produce. And I don't think the case has yet been made. I know the market has made the case, but that doesn't make fully...
My point is that that's not the debate. The fact of the matter is that coming from the tradition, let's say, of Gordon Cullen and Townscape, the word place now has been claimed by a certain image where it's much harder for you to, in a sense, reclaim an alternative image for the word, because the word image, the word place, to my mind, is already in a certain way claimed and contaminated. So it's not like an open discussion where you can discuss with Andres Duaney and you can kind of like win the argument. I mean, in a way, it's the difficulty is the difficulty of the embeddedness of certain images in that word. And therefore, now either we have to produce other images that are very strong in the name of that word, or we have to come up with another way of describing these things that planners do that doesn't necessarily fall into that specific kind of word image classification. So that was a little...
I guess all I would say is this. I find all terminology co-opted and captured by so many people, and we could go through so many words. The Tower of Babel reminds us consistently of how language is a huge problem. And I don't want to cede territory necessarily one way or another. And in fact, Hashem has a very different, definition or thinking of place that does come out of geography. I don't mean that you have it, but you were referencing it specifically. And it's a very powerful term. And whether it's the creation of place or, fighting the forces of globalization, that's what Beguiles' book is all about. And he talks about the radical power of place and that we can't, in fact, escape its grip, talking as a geographer would, in fact, talk. I don't rest my case on that, obviously. The issue is the physical, whatever terminology we ultimately use. I don't happen to fully agree that somehow the new urbanists have grabbed the word place, because I see it, in all sorts of disciplinary references and the literature itself. We can always look for a better word, but as Voltaire reminded us, the best is the enemy of the good. So as long as, and this is the requirement for all of us, as long as we carefully define our terms, whether we use the word urbanism or urban planning or urban studies or whatever it is we use, I think we're going to be okay. If we allow the words to sit out there and your definition is one thing, mine is another, then we lose in communication. So I think it requires, unfortunately, and that's why the communicative stream has so much force with Judith Innes and Patsy Healy and Forrester and the others, define your terms, tendentious as that may be.
Thank you very much, Gerald. This was wonderful. Thank you all for coming. Thank you. Thank you.